In just one closed-door meeting, it was enough to shake the foundation of an entire economic ecosystem that had stood for decades. When Canada and China suddenly announced a 30-day visa waiver, a wave of alarm spread instantly across multiple U.S. border cities, not because of war, but because money was changing direction. How could a tourism policy strip the U.S. of its role as an intermediary? Who stands to gain? Who pays the price? And why is it Washington's own pressure that has pushed Ottawa closer to Beijing than ever before? If you're interested in the geopolitical stories behind seemingly small decisions, don't forget to subscribe and stay with us. Now let's dive into the story. There are moments in geopolitics when, as they unfold, hardly anyone realizes they're witnessing a turning point. There are no gunshots, no military maps, no blazing red headlines on international news. Just a short announcement, a few lines of administrative language, read aloud in a room familiar with power but distant from emotion. And yet it's often in these calm, quiet moments that history changes course. On January 16, 2026, at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney stood beside President Xi Jinping and announced a 30-day visa exemption for Canadian citizens entering China. There was no prolonged applause, no defiant statements, but within that solemn setting, another message was quietly being sent. The Canada-China axis had officially been reconnected, and it was done in a way that a third party could not afford to ignore. Because this wasn't simply about easier travel, it directly touched the flow of people, the flow of money, and the flow of soft power. Over 38 million Canadians could now enter China without a visa. More than 2 million Chinese Canadians could reconnect with their families, their homeland, their business and cultural networks, with a level of flexibility unseen in nearly a decade. And hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of new trips were now being mapped out by airlines, tourism giants, and gateway cities. But across the border, in U.S. cities long accustomed to being the middlemen, the picture looked very different. Seattle, Detroit, Buffalo, places that had once profited from the lack of direct links between Canada and China, began to realize they were about to be cut out of a stream that had sustained many local service industries. As the role of mandatory transit hub vanished, so did the geographic advantage. And the most striking part, the U.S. wasn't pushed out by a hostile declaration, but by its absence in a bilateral decision that, on the surface, had nothing to do with Washington. This is where the story breaks free from the boundaries of tourism or visas. It becomes a sharp snapshot of modern geopolitics, where nations don't need to openly defy each other to escape a sphere of influence. They just need to quietly build alternatives. Canada didn't announce it was distancing itself from the U.S., nor did it pick a side in the U.S.-China rivalry. Ottawa simply opened another door. But when that door opens wide enough, a new path forms, and anyone not on that path is, by default, left behind. To understand why a simple administrative decision carries so much weight and why it emerged after years of frozen bilateral ties, we have to rewind. Because the handshake in Beijing wasn't the beginning. It was the culmination of a long process, one that started with deep fractures in Canada-China relations and was accelerated by the shifts and strains in U.S.-Canada relations over nearly a decade. To understand how a visa waiver could emerge after so many years of deep freeze, we have to go back to the period when Canada-China relations were virtually in total lockdown. It was a time when every interaction between Ottawa and Beijing came with a defensive posture, and every gesture was scrutinized through a lens of suspicion. The arrest of Meng Wanzhou in 2018, seemingly just a matter of complying with legal obligations at the request of the U.S., ended up becoming the deepest fracture in the history of the bilateral relationship. From that moment on, Canada was no longer seen as simply an independent nation, but as an extension of Washington's will in its confrontation with China. The years that followed were grim. 2 Canadian citizens were detained in China, and the diplomatic atmosphere thickened with tension. Canada's key agricultural exports were slapped with heavy tariffs. Canola, the symbol of Canadian farming, was nearly shut out of the Chinese market. High-level visits vanished. Strategic dialogues were suspended indefinitely. The relationship between the two countries was maintained at a bare minimum, not to foster cooperation, but to avoid total collapse. For nearly a decade, Canada lived in a state of paralysis. On one hand, Ottawa was a long-standing ally of the United States, deeply embedded in North America's economic and security architecture. On the other hand, China remained an irreplaceable market for energy, minerals, agriculture, and education. The choice was never spoken aloud, but the cost of standing still became increasingly evident. Canada gradually lost influence in Asia, while its dependence on the US grew deeper and more fragile. The turning point came only when the very foundation of the US-Canada relationship began to wobble. Under Donald Trump, Washington ceased to be the stable partner it once was. Threats of tariffs, high-pressure renegotiations, and especially public remarks that dismissed Canada's sovereignty and interests sent a psychological shockwave through Ottawa's political class. For the first time in decades, Canada was forced to ask, what happens if our most important partner becomes our greatest source of risk? In that context, China was no longer seen as merely an ideological rival, but as a strategic option worth reconsidering. Not to replace the United States, but to reduce absolute dependence. Beijing had its own motivations too. China needed to break out of isolation, needed a G7 country willing to engage in substantive dialogue, and needed reliable supplies of energy, agriculture, and green technology. Those mutual needs found each other in silence, not through grand declarations, but through back-channel talks, discreet exchanges, and a gradual shift in diplomatic language. Mark Carney stepped into his role as Prime Minister at that very moment. He didn't bring a confrontational stance, nor did he attempt to correct the past. Instead, he adopted a cool, pragmatic approach, separate politics from long-term interests, and asked questions about the future, not the past. That's why the meeting in Beijing wasn't framed as an emotional reconciliation. It resembled a strategic agreement between two sides that understood they needed one another, at least in this increasingly uncertain world. From that foundation, concrete steps began to take shape. Not military pacts, not public alliances, but small, seemingly modest decisions with far-reaching impact. Among them, the 30-day visa waiver stands out as the clearest, most visible piece, and also the piece that allows us to most clearly see how a single administrative change can trigger sweeping movements across the economic, social, and geopolitical landscape, something we'll witness firsthand as people begin to move and new advantages begin to form. On paper, a 30-day visa waiver is merely the removal of a bureaucratic step. No massive budget, no tense parliamentary vote, no 100-page binding agreement. But in reality, it's one of the most powerful switches that can trigger the movement of people and money. And when that switch was flipped between Canada and China, the consequences began to ripple out at a speed few in Washington had anticipated. For Canadians, the change was immediate and tangible. No more visa applications that took weeks. No more hundreds of dollars in fees. No more feeling scrutinized just for wanting to enter what used to be their second largest trading partner. All they needed now was a passport, a plane ticket, and a personal plan. That simplicity sparked a crucial psychological shift. China was no longer a conditional destination. It became a normal, even spontaneous choice. For the more than 2 million Chinese Canadians, the impact was even deeper. For years, visiting family, maintaining business ties, or simply staying connected to their cultural roots had all been complicated by visa schedules, bureaucratic stress, and uncertainty. The visa waiver turned trips that used to require months of planning into decisions that could be made in days. And once that psychological barrier disappeared, travel frequency multiplied exponentially. No need for promotional campaigns or official encouragement. This community became the most vibrant, organic bridge between two societies. On the other end, China reaped direct benefits as well. Chinese tourists are known for spending generously, staying longer, and returning frequently. As Canada became a more accessible destination than the US, especially in a climate where Chinese travelers still face a complicated and unpredictable US visa process, the choice became obvious. Cities like Toronto and Vancouver started appearing more frequently in travel plans, consumer forums, and international tour packages. Tourism dollars, instead of flowing through multiple intermediaries, were now going directly into Canadian territory. But the biggest impact of the visa waiver isn't in the number of extra visitors. It lies in how it restructures the way people move across the Pacific. For years, the US served as the default transit hub. Flights from Canada to China often routed through American airports, not just due to frequency, but because the entire aviation ecosystem had been built around that intermediary role. The visa waiver changed that logic entirely. When direct travel becomes easier, faster, and less vulnerable to policy shifts, the need to go through the US virtually disappears. This shift is happening quietly, but its effects are far from minor. Canadian airlines are incentivized to open more direct routes. Airports begin expanding capacity. Cities gear up to receive a new wave of travelers. Meanwhile, south of the border, the places that once thrived off pass-through traffic start to feel the void. Not through a sudden collapse, but through gradually thinning revenue reports, hotel rooms that aren't as full, service counters with shorter lines. And at this point, the visa waiver is no longer just a Canada-China story. It becomes a lens revealing a harsh truth for the United States. Intermediary power is not permanent. When countries find a way to connect directly, those who made their living standing in the middle are the first to feel the pain. U.S. border cities, which once took the Canada-China traffic for granted, now face a question they've never had to seriously ask. What happens when the U.S. is no longer a necessary part of that flow? And the answer to that question is becoming clearer in places that once felt the most secure. As direct flights began to replace the long-established routes that passed through the U.S., the first signs of impact didn't show up on geopolitical maps. They showed up in the accounting books of border cities. In those places, people weren't talking about global strategy or world order. They were talking about empty hotel rooms, declining airport security traffic, and once crowded restaurants growing quieter. The U.S. wasn't pushed out of the flow by a hostile act, but by the quiet absence of travelers who no longer needed to pass through. Seattle is a prime example. For years, the city viewed itself as a natural gateway between North America and the Asia Pacific. It didn't just serve American travelers. Seattle benefited immensely from Canadians transiting through on their way to and from China. Every traveler who stopped for a few hours or overnight left money behind for the airport, hotels, taxis, restaurants. But as direct flights from Vancouver and Toronto to Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou became more convenient and politically stable, Seattle's intermediary role instantly lost its rationale. It wasn't pushed out, just quietly bypassed. Detroit and Buffalo haven't escaped this trend either. Situated close to the border, these cities long thrived on price gaps and infrastructure advantages. Canadians were used to driving across to catch international flights, Soderstien, taking advantage of the denser, often cheaper flight networks. That model had endured for decades to the point of becoming second nature. But when visas stopped being a barrier and direct routes opened up, that obvious behavior vanished. Travelers no longer had a reason to cross the border, wait through U.S. security checks, and deal with the growing unpredictability of American immigration policies. What's notable is that this decline isn't happening through sudden collapse. It's more like a slow drain. A little less each day, a few percentage points each month. And it's precisely this gradual nature that makes it dangerous. It doesn't generate national headlines, but it quietly erodes the financial foundations of local economies. Declining airport revenue leads to scaled back investments. Empty hotel rooms lead to seasonal layoffs. City budgets come under strain, and Washington has few tools to intervene. The root of the problem is that the U.S. has grown so used to being the center that it assumed the role was permanent. For decades, much of the Trans-Pacific flow passed through U.S. territory, not just because of geography, but because visa systems, aviation networks, and financial flows were built around that central role. But as countries begin removing bottlenecks and connecting directly, being the intermediary is no longer an advantage. It becomes a vulnerability. The U.S. hasn't lost its overall power, but it is steadily losing the ability to profit from simply being in the middle. From a geopolitical standpoint, this is a quiet failure. There has been no strong protest from Washington because formally Canada hasn't done anything wrong. Visa waivers are a sovereign right. Opening direct flight routes is a commercial decision. But when you piece together all the fragments, a clear picture emerges. The U.S. is being cut out of a value chain it once controlled with ease. And what stings most in Washington isn't the loss of influence over China, it's the loss of role in the relationship between China and one of its closest allies. While American border cities scramble to adjust, Canada is already entering a phase of preparation for an even bigger boost. These new travelers aren't just typical tourists. They're the audience for a global event, one where every policy decision gets amplified in impact. As the 2026 World Cup approaches, everything the visa waiver has set in motion begins to scale up, transforming an administrative advantage into an economic and national branding advantage. And it's precisely at this intersection of soccer, tourism, and geopolitics that America's sideline position becomes more visible than ever. The 2026 World Cup arrives at the perfect moment to transform a simple administrative decision into a game-changing strategic advantage. For years, global sporting events were seen as short-lived festivals, temporary tourist spikes that quickly faded. But for Canada, this World Cup isn't just about soccer. It's a test run for the entire new architecture of connectivity Ottawa has just built with Beijing, and a chance to convert the latent benefits of visa waivers into real, tangible gains. Toronto and Vancouver aren't just host cities. They are symbols of a multicultural open Canada, where Chinese communities have been deeply woven into the social and economic fabric for decades. For Chinese fans, the World Cup isn't simply about watching a match. It's an experience. It's a chance to combine sports, travel, family visits, shopping, and even investment. With visas no longer a barrier, deciding to come to Canada has never felt easier. No complex paperwork, no agonizing over unpredictable US border policies. Everything is wrapped in one clear, safe choice. And that clarity also applies to the flow of money. Direct flights into Canada, hotel bookings in Toronto and Vancouver, concentrated spending within Canadian territory. What might once have leaked through US transit points now stays almost entirely within Canada. Organizers, host cities, and the Canadian government all understand that the World Cup will amplify every advantage already in place. A friendly visa policy is a plus in normal times. In the context of a global event, it becomes a lever. More importantly, the World Cup creates a psychological effect no marketing campaign could match. When hundreds of thousands of Chinese citizens travel to Canada in a short time frame, the image of an accessible, welcoming, and efficient nation spreads rapidly. Personal stories, spontaneous connections, and business relationships forged on the sidelines of the pitch will outlast the final whistle. The World Cup ends, but the movement doesn't. It leaves behind a momentum of travel that is very difficult to reverse once it's in motion. On the flip side, the US faces an awkward paradox. It's a co-host of the World Cup, yet it's not the most accessible destination for one of the world's largest fan markets. With US visas still a complicated, unpredictable hurdle, many Chinese fans are simply skipping American cities altogether. Instead of pulling the US back into the center of the flow, the World Cup has, ironically, highlighted how Washington has sidelined itself through its own rigid policies. And when the stadium lights go out, what remains isn't just a set of tourism numbers or ticket sales. What the World Cup triggers is a new layer of connectivity where tourism is only the beginning. Air travel infrastructure expands, business networks reconnect, educational and cultural exchanges accelerate. From here, the Canada-China relationship enters a new phase, deeper, more resilient, and far beyond the scope of short-term visits. And that's when the story moves beyond tourism into a new framework of relations now quietly taking shape. Once direct flights become the norm and the movement of people is no longer interrupted by red tape or psychological hesitation, tourism is merely the most visible surface layer of a much deeper structure taking shape. Beneath the numbers of visitors and hotel revenues lies a new web of connections, where economic interests, strategic calculations, and political trust are beginning to intertwine in ways that are increasingly irreversible. Visa waivers trigger an effect that policymakers understand well. When the cost of access drops to near zero, every other form of exchange becomes easier. Entrepreneurs no longer need to weigh whether a market scouting trip is worth the hassle of a visa. Research delegations, startup groups, investment funds, all can meet more frequently, more quickly, more flexibly. Meetings that once required months of planning can now happen in just weeks. And in the world of business, speed is one of the greatest competitive advantages. Canada, as a resource-rich economy with a modest population, has long sought to diversify its partnerships to avoid becoming overly dependent on any single market. China, now in a phase of economic restructuring, needs stable supplies of energy, critical minerals, and high-quality agricultural products. These needs are not new, but what is new is the low-friction environment they're now placed in. When people move easily, contracts are signed faster, and commitments become more concrete. Alongside economics are education and culture, fields often underestimated yet capable of producing powerful delayed reverse effects. Chinese students in Canada bring more than tuition fees. They carry long-term relational networks. With visa barriers removed, exchange programs, conferences, and research collaborations can resume after years of disruption. A new generation of connection begins to take shape, one less haunted by past crises and more accustomed to seeing bilateral relations as normal, not exceptional. At the political level, this new architecture of relations has a striking characteristic. It doesn't need grand declarations to exist. There are no formal alliances, no security pacts, no confrontational rhetoric, but that's exactly why it's more resilient to external pressure. When thousands of businesses, millions of people, and dozens of cities have direct interests tied to this bilateral flow, reversing course becomes politically expensive. This is where the US faces its greatest challenge. Washington can exert pressure at the national level, but it's far harder to dismantle a network of interests rooted in local economies and communities. When Canadian airports expand to accommodate more flights from China, when provinces benefit from booming agricultural exports, when universities rely on international students, any attempt to turn away means inflicting damage on oneself. This new architecture of relations functions like a self-locking system. The longer it runs, the harder it is to unwind. More importantly, Canada has learned a strategic lesson. Diversification is not betrayal, it's self-preservation. By building a parallel line of connection alongside the traditional US-Canada axis, Ottawa isn't abandoning its ally, but it's no longer placing its entire future in a single basket. China, for its part, understands the value of having a G7 partner capable of pragmatic dialogue, unbound by the binary logic of confrontation. Looking back, the 30-day visa waiver was just the first door opened. Behind that door lies a long corridor of overlapping projects, relationships, and commitments. Once people become accustomed to traveling, doing business, and collaborating without obstruction, returning to a frozen state becomes almost unthinkable. And it's at this point that modern geopolitics reveals a cold truth. Power no longer lies in the ability to block, but in the ability to create flows that others have no choice but to adapt to. When all the pieces are laid side by side, what emerges is no longer just a story about visas or tourism. It becomes a textbook geopolitical lesson. The visa waiver between Canada and China wasn't some masterstroke crafted decades in advance. It was the natural outcome of a chain reaction. In that chain, every pressure tactic, every threat, and every act of instability from the US inadvertently pushed Ottawa closer toward forging its own path. Donald Trump believed that applying pressure would force Canada to stay firmly within its familiar orbit. But modern geopolitics doesn't operate under such simplistic coercive logic. When a partner becomes unpredictable, the natural response of nations isn't open confrontation. It's diversification as a form of self-preservation. Canada didn't abandon the US, but neither did it accept being locked into a single option. And it was only when Ottawa opened the door to Beijing that Washington realized it had, in fact, shrunk its own role. The self-inflicted wound here wasn't the loss of an ally. It was the loss of the intermediary position that had delivered enormous benefits for decades. When flows are redirected directly and administrative barriers are removed, the power of being in the middle stops being an advantage. It becomes a relic of an old order. No one feels this more acutely than America's border cities, because they are the first to pay the price for a shift Washington failed to anticipate. What's most striking is that no one in this story ever declared victory. China didn't publicly challenge the US. Canada didn't trumpet a new world order. Everything happened quietly, pragmatically, effectively. And yet, it is precisely that silence, that makes the consequences more profound. Once relationships are woven into a tight web of mutual interests, breaking them apart through political pressure becomes costly, if not impossible. And that may be the biggest lesson of all. In today's world, power doesn't lie in the ability to issue commands. It lies in the ability to make others want to walk beside you. When you're no longer seen as a reliable partner, other nations won't wait for you to change. They'll build alternatives. The Canada-China 30-day visa waiver is just one example of this rule in action. But it's certainly not the last. If you have a different perspective on this decision, or believe the US still holds strong enough cards to pull Canada back into its traditional role, leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you'd like to keep following deep dive analysis on the geopolitical moves shaping the world, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next video.